Great. Okay, so I'm delighted to introduce tonight's speaker, Lydia White. She's a marine ecologist who's currently based at the University of Helsinki in Finland at their Centre for Coastal Ecosystems and Climate Change Research. Her PhD, which she did at Queen's University in Belfast, focused on rocky shore ecology and specifically on how seaweeds respond to different elements of global change. More recently, she's extended this to research how subtidal kelp forests respond to climate change and how this might affect the global carbon cycle. She's carried out this research firstly at Roscoff in France and now in Helsinki. I'm delighted to introduce her to what's going to be a really fascinating talk. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and then I'm going to hand you over to Lydia. Thank you.
Where am I? Thanks, Maria. I hope you can hear me okay.
Yeah, that's fine. And you can see your slides, that's fine.
Great. Thanks for the invitation. It's nice to see so many people interested in this topic. And also bear with me, it's a couple of hours ahead. So it's actually 9 o'clock here. So, well, hopefully I'm not too tired after a day in the lab. So yeah, my talk's about rocky shore ecology and specifically thinking about how rocky shores kind of are responding to climate change, yeah, in general. Yes, so rocky shores in general are really quite interesting habitats if you're lucky enough to be close enough to see them. So throughout my PhD, I did quite a lot of work, mostly on coasts around Ireland. So this was one of my field sites for my PhD, and they can look quite homogeneous and quite similar, but actually when you start looking a bit closer, they've actually got quite a lot of different species. They're quite diverse. And there's quite a lot of different interactions happening at this kind of small local scale. So for example, even within these little rock pools, you'll have lots of different species of seaweed, different herbivores eating the seaweeds, and different predators then feeding on the herbivores. So one of the kind of, I guess, perhaps the most well-known things about rocky shore is how they have quite clear zonation. So depending on where the water level is, so where these organisms live on the shore in relation to the tidal height, really determines what species you have living there. So for example, in the high tide zone, the things living up here are really going to be uncovered and exposed to the air for quite the majority of their time. So up here we have things like barnacles and kind of some small seaweeds that can cope in this kind of quite harsh environment. And then as we go further down, kind of closer to the subtidal zone, we tend to get more species and higher diversity and kind of more dominant seaweeds, which need a bit more water, basically. So yeah, as I mentioned, what limits the upper shore is really the environment. So it can be a really harsh environment for these organisms to live because it can be really sunny, it can be really hot, but it can also be really, really cold. So when there's storms, things like this will really affect the species living there. So they need to be quite tolerant to all these different stresses. The other thing is obviously wave exposure. If you're living at the top of the shore and you're getting battered by storms, you need to be able to survive this environment. So there's not so many species because they have to be kind of adapted to this way of life. Then further down the shore, kind of towards the subtidal area, it's much more stable. So the conditions are much more constant because there's less exposure to the air. So here is kind of a bit of a fight for space. So there's lots of competition between the organisms living there. So between the different animals, between the different species of seaweed, and there's lots of interactions happening kind of between these species living there. So just to kind of go through some of the organisms that live in these different habitats. So for example, at the high shore, it's really dominated by animals. So specifically kind of barnacles, lots of barnacles, and a few species of seaweeds that can cope with this desiccation stress and cope with being exposed. So for example, in this photo here, we can see on the bottom right, you can see this really kind of clear band of where the barnacles can survive, basically. And here there's little competition with other things, so they can kind of withstand this exposure to the air for long periods of time. But it can be quite an intense environment to live in. So one of the main predators of barnacles are dog whelks. So these kind of gastropod mollusks, and basically they feed predominantly on mussels and barnacles up at the higher levels of the shore. So basically they're really well adapted. So they have basically a radula, which you can see in the diagram here. It's basically like a kind of drill. So what happens is they secrete a specific chemical which weakens the shell of these animals that they're trying to consume, and then this weakens the hull, the shell, and then they can exert their radula, which basically drills through the shell. So you can see this is a close-up under the microscope on the left of the radula, and it basically has these serrated teeth which can chip away at the shell, and that means that these predators can then basically extract the soft tissues from inside the organisms and eat them, basically. So it's quite a convenient adaptation. Because barnacles have quite a hard life. When you think about it, it's not a very nice place to live. And for them, the other problem is that they can't move. So when they're there, they're stuck, basically. So there aren't so many options for partners. So, finding a mate who isn't your brother or your sister is quite difficult. So actually, I guess one of the things that you learn very early on in a degree in marine biology is that barnacles have the largest penises relative to their body size for, I think, the whole world, basically. So they can be about 10 times their own body length. And that means that they can actually kind of go further than their immediate neighbors to find someone to mate with. And whilst actually researching this today, I found out that this penis length is a trait that varies depending on where they live. So what those that live in a more exposed environment actually have longer ones to, I don't know, find a mate further afield. So even I'm learning things in this talk. And as a result of this, they're pretty efficient colonizers. So these photos are actually of an art installation up in Crosby near Liverpool, where I spent quite a few years for my bachelor's and actually did experiments on statues. This is what happens basically when you install a hard substrate in the middle of a sandy area. they will get completely colonized by barnacles and mussels. So for example, this art installation is 100 cast iron statues of the artist Anthony Gormley. And I think within 1 year, they got completely covered in barnacles. And this was actually supposed to be a moving art installation that would get kind of relocated at different beaches across Europe. But actually, whilst I was at the university, we kind of campaigned to get them to stay in Liverpool because they were completely kind of colonized. They'd become part of the natural habitat. So thankfully, they decided to keep them there, actually. So kind of moving further down the shore, this is where in the mid area things get a bit more colourful. And personally, I find it a bit more interesting. So we've kind of here, you've got like a mosaic of different seaweed species and animals. So for example, things like anemones, small crabs, and lots of grazers feeding on this kind of different seaweed species. And yeah, and so one of the animals is really common in this part of the shore is limpets, and these are often considered kind of gardeners of the shore. So these mollusks, what they do is when the tide is down, they basically kind of clamp onto the rock to prevent any desiccation stress or to prevent anything from eating them, and they basically just kind of clamp down and stay inside their shell. And then as soon as the tide comes in, they then kind of unclamp themselves and wander around the shore. And it's actually, what they do is they're like gardeners. They cultivate these little gardens of microalgae that they feed on, and they know when to harvest it, and then they let it grow, and then they'll go back and harvest the same areas rather than just letting things kind of grow too fast or let it get untamed. And you can see these they're called home scars where these organisms live, and often you can see them really pronounced on the rock of kind of these little homes that are perfectly fitted to their shells after years and years of living there, which I think is quite cool. And then as we get to the lower shore, here can be really diverse and can be really interesting places to explore. So often they're dominated with lots of big macroalgae, so like kelps, and you can see these when it's low tide. But there's also lots of other animals, so things like nudibranchs, which are what are called as sea slugs, and starfish and things like this. And my personal favorite seaweed, which is this red one on the left, which is called something like fat juicy sausage weed, because it in theory looks like sausages. And it's in this area where there can be quite a lot of foraging opportunities. So there can be lots of crabs. These ones in this photo here are quite small, as you can see, based on the size of the mussel. But if you have a good low tide, you really can, and if you're in the right area, you can find quite a lot of things to eat. So different crabs. Sometimes at low tide, I would also go looking for shrimps. So basically, you just need a kind of quite big net, and you can find these guys in the rock pools and in the shallow habitats. There are obviously restrictions about what you can take, when you can take, and the sizes, and it's always worth checking these out before you do any kind of foraging. And this photo on the left actually is from in France. So in France, we have, where I've been living for the last couple of years, they also have abalones. So you see quite a lot of people out on the shore when it's a good spring tide, specifically looking for these animals because apparently they taste very good. But it's not only animals. I think over the last couple of years, there's more and more focus on trying to encourage people to eat seaweed, which when done kind of when things are harvested sustainably can be, I think a really good kind of foraging activity. I really recommend this book actually for both for seaweed and animals. It has all the regulations, kind of everything you need to know about collecting these kind of things. Obviously right now where you would go out looking for these would be quite dependent on the kind of sewage situation. I've been following the news quite a lot about all the sewage being pumped into the coastal area. So you definitely want to check those kind of things before you collect anything or think about eating anything. Definitely. And yeah, so these systems are really kind of under quite a lot of stress. And that's something that I've been that's been the main area of my research over the last few years, is actually thinking about these different kind of environmental pressures on these habitats. So one of the main ones, I mean, you can't really ignore it looking at the news, is obviously climate change. And the thing is that most of these organisms living on the shore have quite a kind of, they have quite a variable environment. The water's always changing, the temperature is always changing, and you know they're quite well adapted to coping with environmental variability. But what they struggle with is extreme events. So when we have a heat wave, or when there's a really extreme cold spell, these organisms are just, you know, are not adapted for that. It kind of pushes them over this threshold that they're already used to. And unfortunately, these are kind of two things that are really accentuating with climate change, is that we're seeing more heat waves and more kind of intense storms. So for example, I don't know how much was documented in the UK, but especially on the west coast of Canada, last year they had these kind of mass mortality events where all of these mussels and organisms living on the shore were just died because of the heat wave, because the air is just it's so heats up so much quicker than the water. So actually it's kind of the exposure to the air which is just decimating these communities during heat waves. But there's also lots of other stresses. So for example, this more kind of human activity related or directly attributable to humans. So harvesting, just kind of harvesting on the shore of different mollusks and things like that can actually have quite a big impact. So where I used to do a lot of field work on the west coast of Ireland, you would actually see a lot of people out collecting periwinkles, collecting different kind of sea snails and cockles to sell to local restaurants. And the amount that might seem quite small to begin with, but when you think that they're doing that every day on different shores, it can kind of amount up to quite large quantities. And where I lived in Brittany for a couple of years, we would often see these boats out collecting seaweed, and they would be doing this like 5 times a day, every day, just filling up kind of big shipping containers full of seaweed, and it can have quite a big impact on the local community. And obviously another big thing is pollution, which I just touched upon with the sewage and things like that. So this photo was actually from the northeast coast from last year, and actually kind of looking into it, they couldn't really find a cause of all of these washed up invertebrates on the shore. But we had similar scenes, I know, in 2018, following the kind of beast from the east and the big storms that happened in autumn in 2018, and just kind of getting all of these invertebrates deposited on the shore. So I know that this photo here they kind of were suggesting that this might be because of some pollution. And also perhaps dredging in the local area, which kind of basically just rips up all of these organisms, and means they end up dead here on the shore. And so basically rocky shore ecology has really had a lot of well, there's been quite a lot of research in this area and quite a lot of studies done, and these go back all the way to Darwin in the 1850s. Everyone kind of thinks of finches when we come to Darwin, but he actually spent about 8 years doing research on barnacles because he was kind of really fascinated by how they worked. I think he actually thought they were mollusks to begin with rather than crustaceans. But these kind of early observations are really important for understanding these different species, and really kind of led the foundation for time series and yeah, just how important it is to have repeated studies of these species. So I mean, a time series is just kind of repeated observations in the same place over a number of years. And for rocky shore ecology, because I mean, rocky shores and the intertidal area is always an area that people can actually go to on foot. You don't need any dive gear, you don't need any equipment, you just need to be near a beach. And you just need, you know, to be able to look at what you can see. So there's quite a few kind of time series that exist within the UK, and basically they've all been kind of small localized efforts at different institutes, but going back to the 60s, the 70s. So the Dove Marine Lab in Newcastle used to have a time series back in the 80s, and then also Robins Hood Bay, which was part of Leeds University, and then also the Sherkin Island Marine Station. And basically there were lots of surveys happening, organised by these different institutes. And then also by the Marine Biological Association in Plymouth. And basically more recently, there was kind of this project Marklim, where they drew all these data together and kind of repeatedly surveyed the same environments to try and see if we can kind of make a comparison between what we're seeing now and what we might have seen 40 years ago, and can we link these changes to climate change and to trends in temperature. So yeah, it's really the kind of the most inclusive time series for rocky shores that we have globally. And this is still going on now, I think, unless their funding got cut. But generally they survey up to 100 different sites every year, and they always survey them at the same time in the season. And then they can specifically track these different species of invertebrates and macroalgae. And from this, they can kind of track which species are doing well, which species are doing not so well. And kind of, yeah, from that we can see some winners and losers from climate change. So basically what's happening is we kind of have some species in the UK who are perhaps kind of warm water species that have gradually spread throughout the UK. And these are kind of generally are continuing to spread north as our oceans warm. There's more habitat that is now suitable to their kind of thermal niche. And we see these guys spreading north, so particularly Undaria pinnatifida, which is this brown algae here, which is basically invading loads of different harbours across the UK. And basically what's happening is it's kind of, this actually comes from the Southwest Pacific, and it's just spread over the globe basically. So what happened is people imported it to Brittany. They actually started farming this species of seaweed, and then it's basically kind of spread across Europe from them. So it attaches to the hulls of boats. The boats then travel from harbour to harbour, and it kind of is on the move basically. And then we also have some species. So for example, Alaria esculenta, which is another type of seaweed, and this is more at the edge of its range. So it's kind of basically it's getting too warm for this seaweed. So what we see is a retraction at the southern end of its range. So yeah, we kind of have winners and losers, and we see replacements of some species by others. And alongside time series, there's obviously other ways that we as kind of ecologists are studying these different processes. So quite often what we do is we do manipulative experiments on the shore. These are just a few photos from my kind of PhD work, where perhaps we artificially manipulate what's going on in the shore. So for example, we increase the amount of pollution or nutrient enrichment in these small areas. We exclude different predators to see what happens if we're if we're harvesting all of the crabs and the predators from the system, what will happen to the communities that we have there. And then the other kind of things that we often use to study, because the thing is with time series, if we want to, if you really want enough data to confidently kind of say that species are changing in response to global warming, for example, you basically need 30 years of data to be able to detect a signal. And that's really a lot of manpower. That's a lot of people counting barnacles on shores. So what we do as ecologists is we basically speed things up, and we kind of artificially impose pressures on communities on the shore, or for example in tanks or mesocosms, which is basically a body of water in which we put some kind of organisms that we want to study. This could be things like microalgae, for example in this tank just in the lab, or these can be really quite big, kind of quite complex experimental setups. So for example, this big mesocosm here, which is part of the infrastructure at Kiel University in Germany, you can see kind of how deep into the water column they're going, and how these are basically the kind of like, mini ecosystems inside a tube. And then I mean, they extend really quite deep. What we can see from the top is basically just this little bubble. So this middle photo is actually from my institute where I work at the minute in Finland. But these are obviously extending kind of meters and meters into the sea. So I thought I'd just highlight a kind of few different ways that people can get involved. Obviously, it's very location dependent. Lots of the rocky shores are kind of on the south coast or the west coast, but there are different ways to get involved. One of the big ones is the Big Seaweed Search, which is organised by the Natural History Museum, and I know this is still kind of happening, and it's really quite a simple way to get involved. There's also Porcupine, which has quite a lot of volunteers, and is kind of the Marine Natural History Society. And then there are also kind of other projects which are perhaps more from the research and from the science side. So for example, Capturing Our Coast was I think an EU project that tried to train volunteers to go out on the shore and actually contribute to understanding the time series, and kind of just adding more data to help us understand how these communities are changing. And another one which is the Rock Pool project, and this is done quite well and continues to be quite active. But unfortunately, this is on the south coast, so it's kind of predominantly around Plymouth. But there are quite a lot of different resources available and different community projects, and I know these guys are quite active within schools, and kind of organising different outreach activities. So I thought I'd kind of go a little bit deeper from the shore, because this is a bit more kind of what I'm working on now. And also has been getting quite a lot of attention in the media and in the research community, is kind of macroalgal forests, because there's a lot of focus on carbon and climate change. And we know that these systems kind of are photosynthesizing and turning carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, which then dissolves into the marine environment. And they're converting this via photosynthesis kind of into tissues. And this kind of all comes under the main framework of blue carbon. So blue carbon is essentially carbon that gets fixed from the atmosphere via photosynthesis, and is then stored in some way kind of for long term. So lots of the habitats that are really important for this are salt marshes, seagrass, and mangroves. And these habitats, what they have in common is that they basically have kind of sediment below or soil. And what happens is that the carbon they fix into their tissues is then being stored within the sediment below. But the thing with algae is, yes, they photosynthesize, yes, they have fixed carbon, but they're on a rocky habitat. So there aren't so many places for this kind of carbon to go. And it's basically been argued that for these habitats, for algae to contribute to blue carbon, this kind of carbon needs to get buried somewhere. So what I'm working on at the minute is basically kind of how we quantify these seaweed communities and whether they contribute to blue carbon. So to do this, we need to basically measure lots of different things simultaneously. So we need to measure how these organisms are photosynthesizing, how are they respiring, and then where is this food going up the food web, and then also are these seaweeds then going into the deep sea where they're being buried to be considered kind of carbon burial, and ultimately removing this carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So basically kind of one of the ways that we do this is we build chambers to incubate these different seaweeds and look at the carbon fluxes and how much they're photosynthesizing within the kelp forest. And basically, so this is just a kind of schematic of the project that I'm working on at the minute, is that basically our main hypothesis is that the kind of healthy ecosystems are going to be much more effective at drawing down carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So we think that these habitats are basically more likely to be carbon sinks, and whereas degraded habitats, we know that they emit more carbon dioxide and more methane, and ultimately are kind of carbon sources. And these are really important when we think about what areas we want to protect and kind of what is a priority for policy. So I've just kind of started within this big 5-year project at the University of Helsinki, and then also with Stockholm, bringing together kind of a really big area of expertise. So we have the marine ecologists like me, the people who go out and count things and look at species, but we also have a big team of biogeochemists, atmospheric scientists, and physicists to kind of try and really look at how these flows of carbon are going from the seaweed into the sediment, into the water column, and then actually into the atmosphere, so we can really get a holistic understanding of kind of what's happening. And yeah, just a few photos of the Marine Research Station where I work. These are the kind of habitats that we're surveying. Yeah, here in Finland. And kind of how I mentioned a few of the kind of rocky shore initiatives going on to get people out helping. one of the things that is actually a really good organisation and really effective at doing this within the UK and Ireland is Search, and they actually have a really active network of volunteers, and I know they train about 300 volunteers a year. So this is something that's continuing to be quite active. If there's any divers wanting to get involved, they're really a good group to get in with. Yeah, and that's it. Just a few of the funders that I've been working with over the last few years. Yeah, and that's it. Thanks very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Lydia. Yeah, if you want to just stop your screen share and then we'll kind of go on to questions. That's perfect. Thank you. So that was a really great introduction, I think, because you really kind of introduced some of the aspects of rocky shore ecology, and we had some fascinating facts to kind of share and ponder on, which was great. And I also thought it was then really helpful for you to describe your kind of current research and other research that's kind of being done. It's really the kind of work on the kelp systems and their role in the kind of carbon cycle. That sounds really fascinating. Obviously, it'd be kind of interesting to know how that develops and what you kind of you find out. And I think it's also helpful to give people a sense about the citizen science. And a kind of couple of questions in the chat particularly came through were about that, so we might even kind of expand on that a little bit more. I'm going to kind of go to kind of coming through. So is that all right, Anchor, if you pick that up?
Hi, yeah, I'm sorry. My my internet is getting really, really dodgy. So I hope I don't get kicked out again. I've already been kicked out once.
Yeah, I saw you went and came back.
Yeah, and you guys are kind of coming in and out. So there were some questions that I managed to pick up before I got booted out and lost the chat. And I think Kieran, if I miss any, he can cover the rest. So there were some questions about the sewage discharge and pollution. So Jules was asking how these organisms were coping with the sewage discharge, and presumably that it's enriching the water and nitrates.
Yeah. Am I? No, I'm not muted. Definitely, like there's going to be big inputs of nitrate. And the thing is, I think it's probably just a bit too soon to tell in terms of the kind of local, the more recent discharges that have been taking place and kind of well documented, I guess, over the last couple of months. And the thing is, there's so many things happening simultaneously, it can be quite difficult to specifically link this activity with, perhaps mortality. But this is, often what happens is there'll be an enrichment of nitrates, and this will then cause an algal bloom, which is stimulated by the nitrates, which will then have knock-on effects for the invertebrates. So it can be quite difficult to actually link the cause and kind of response that we see. But from what I've seen, I haven't seen any mass mortality events publicized yet. So I guess we wait and see what happens.
Well, sort of related to that, so maybe you can kind of talk a little bit more about your research. So R. O'Connor was asking, does your research touch upon effects of nitrogen and excess nutrients pollution from agriculture and residential runoff waters? And do algal blooms, as you just mentioned, have deleterious effects upon the populations that you study?
Definitely. I do work on that a bit, especially at the minute where I am in the Baltic, which has a really historic or big history of nutrient enrichment. So basically we see two things. One thing is that because of the increased nitrates in the water, we see increased algal blooms, and this reduces the light that can penetrate into the seafloor. So we basically see things kind of dying on the seafloor, and increased bacterial activity and just really low oxygen. Because basically you've got all this dead degrading matter on the sea floor, full of bacteria, and basically consuming all the oxygen. And then you can get hypoxic areas forming. So yeah, and they're more pronounced in areas with low water flow. So one of the great things about the UK and the Northeast Atlantic is because of the tides, the water's being flushed really irregularly. So these are less of an issue. But if you're somewhere more sheltered and with like less water flow, you can really, these kind of impacts are much more accentuated. And the other thing that we can see from this kind of increased runoff and increased agricultural kind of related nitrates is that we also get stimulation of other seaweeds. So like it's quite a kind of filamentous, fluffy algae that you can see, which basically grows on everything. And this also kind of degrades quite quickly. So what happens is it's photosynthesizing and it's fixing carbon, which is good, but it doesn't live very long. And it then degrades quite quickly, and the carbon is just returned to the atmosphere. Whereas if you have instead this being kind of captured by a kelp forest, that's going to live for 20 years. So this kind of, it's a very quick turnover of carbon. That's what happens in these enriched environments. So yeah, for climate change, it's not great.
Yeah. I mean, you kind of touched on this a little bit in your previous answer. So Robin was asking, how different is the rocky shore ecology in the Baltic from the British Isles with the colder winters and smaller tidal range?
Well, basically where I am, there's no tide. So there is no rocky shore. It's just all underwater. So in that way, it's very different. But the big thing is the water movement. So where I am at the minute in the Baltic, for the water to be refreshed in the whole of the sea takes 30 years. So it's like a badly flushing toilet, basically. So anything going in stays there all the time. Whereas in the Northeast Atlantic, it's such a big sea and the tides are so powerful that everything is kind of getting continuously kind of refreshed quite quickly.
Just, completely different question. Maureen was asking, she says, I think mussels are farmed both on the seabed and on ropes. Environmentally, is there a big advantage of the rope method to avoid seabed disturbance?
Yeah, so basically, if you think about growing mussels on a rope, they're basically taking up space that wasn't being used before. It's basically just sea, and you're then adding something which kind of, you're not taking up space from anyone else. So ecologically, rope-grown mussels are really good things to consume, because also they're actively removing things from the water, they're filtering the water. So yeah, rope-grown mussels are a big yes environmentally.
So just to clarify something with that, Lydia, I'm guessing what you're meaning there as well is if they're grown on the bed, that's got to be cleared, obviously, first of all. So
yeah, exactly. Yeah, so there you're kind of like destructively removing them from the seabed, then you will have to wait for them to recolonize. So it's kind of a bit more destructive, yeah, in terms of damaging the seafloor.
And then related to farming, Andrew was wondering, is farming introduced species of seaweed dangerous to established ecologies as they escape into the wild? Should we base seaweed farming on non-introduced species or more native species? So
now there are quite strict regulations, especially, well, in the UK and Ireland. What I'm aware of is that, yeah, you really, it has to be species that are already there. Because basically what happened in Brittany is they brought this invasive species into farm and it's kind of spread everywhere. So I think everyone has now learned from what happened in the past. So it's quite highly regulated now. So yeah.
And R. O'Connor had another question. He or she, I'm not sure, just R. Can remote sensing and satellite imaging provide an evidence base with regards to algal blooms and identifiable habitats such as seagrass?
Yeah, so this is quite a hot topic at the minute of ecology, and it's quite specifically, there's not so much you can do when when things are submerged, but in tidal areas when the tide is out, basically based on hyperspectral imaging, you can kind of roughly quantify different habitats. So for example, brown algae, seagrasses, mussel beds, things like this can be used with hyperspectral imaging, but it requires quite a lot of ground truthing, and this is what's happening in the minute. There's quite a lot of studies that are kind of methodological to test whether these work. But the thing is, just because they work in one place doesn't mean they will work in another place. So it's it's trying to make sure it's, you know, economically viable, requires quite a lot of testing. But these are things that are getting more and more kind of common for monitoring, because obviously you can cover such a large amount of space, you know, much more than you could with people.
There was just one last question from H. Tennyson, who was asking, are there any Irish rocky shore ecology voluntary projects that you know of?
Oh, good question. So I know, for example, Sea Search, which is the kind of diving related subtidal thing, they are quite active within Ireland, but intertidal stuff, I don't know. I'm sorry. There are specific places that have like bioblitz. So this will be a particular event on one day where they try and find kind of as many species as possible. And it might be in the terrestrial environment, but simultaneously, they will also run events in the intertidal. So I know some of these have been done at kind of, I think, in association with Belfast Marine Lab and maybe also Trinity. So there are a few events, but yeah, they're not that widespread.
And I can see that Kira's been putting links to some of the projects, things that you've mentioned into the chat. And we may, when we kind of circulate the email to let people know the recording's available, we can add, you know, pop the links on there as well so that people can follow things up. But yeah, thank you. It's really helpful to, I think, you know, obviously people are quite keen to get involved, and it's really helpful to kind of know how they can go about that, and in sort of areas that are near to them, because you know, it clearly has got a lot of potential. I mean, even if the people are not able to do, you know, diving, obviously that's, you know, quite ambitious. But kind of, yeah, but the kind of, you know, survey and things like the seaweeds and that sort of thing, that is something that's kind of accessible to a range of people. So obviously, you know, the more people that can get involved with that, the better. I was just going to ask you something about the seaweeds. And what is the kind of physiological or morphological adaptations that mean that different seaweeds are found at different sort of levels? So what's special about the ones that can kind of tolerate the kind of more extreme conditions at the top of the shore, as opposed to the ones that kind of are restricted to sort of lower down? And also, you know, the ones that are adapted to different sorts of water temperatures. What's kind of going on that's underlying that?
Good question, and I'm not a physiologist, but often it can be to do with the morphology. So it's kind of based on, for example, like the surface area to volume ratio. So kind of how much is actually being exposed to the desiccation stress, and whether often they, for example, like brown seaweeds would have quite a leathery, kind of quite hard surface. So that means that they can cope with desiccation stress, whereas lots of red seaweeds are actually really thin, and basically they can't really cope with, they would just die. So it's often to do with this kind of protective structures.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah. Okay. And I guess, that's where you get, this kind of the gradation of different species, so types, and then with different species. That's obviously, I mean, I just kind of find that quite fascinating that you're getting sort of fairly similar organisms, but they're adapted to quite sort of different conditions. So that's obviously something to do with, if I did the seaweed survey, I'm sure I'd kind of find out more about that. But that's really helpful. Thank you. So we're almost at the end. I don't know if there's one or two last questions that people want to pose, or if anybody wants to do a question in person. We've just about got a minute or so before we wrap up. So this is your last chance. Is there anything else?
There's one other question from Tony. What are the biggest pollutants in Helsinki and the Baltic, and where is it coming from?
So, well, I kind of mentioned it, but the big thing here is nutrients. So there's such kind of big population around the Baltic for quite a small catchment area, and the residence times of the water are so low that these things really hang around, basically. And the same thing is true is from warming, because it's kind of like it's like a bath, basically. There's not much water movement within the water body, that we're kind of, and it's also quite shallow. I think the average depth of the Baltic is about 60 meters, whereas in the Atlantic it would be hundreds of meters. So it's going to warm up much quicker than any other seas. So for that, it's quite a good, cool place to study things, because it's kind of like a natural mesocosm. Things that are happening here, we wouldn't expect to see in other seas for kind of much longer time periods.
Thank you. So obviously, we do let us know about how your research develops, and perhaps in the future when you've got we develop more understanding about how these systems are working. It'd be nice to kind of maybe have you back, and you can update and keep us updated, because it sounds really fascinating research. Thank you so much for coming along and sharing all that with us. It's been a really interesting session, and we do have another, as Kieran popped into the chat, next year in April. 13th of April, we've got another session about marine ecology and the marine world with Francis Dipper. So if this has whetted your appetite, then please do kind of come along to that as well. We'll circulate details of the recording of tonight's talk as soon as they're available, and we'll also make sure that you get access to all the links of the different kind of organisations that Lydia's mentioned. And if you want to pop on, add to that, Lydia, any kind of contact about your particular project, then do that if people would like to kind of get in touch and find out more about what's going on in Helsinki. It's certainly so interesting to think it's how differently that's functioning, and that's incredibly slow kind of replacement replacement level of the water. That it's just very different, as you say, to the kind of what's happening particularly on the west coast of Britain. Is really interesting, and makes it obviously very interesting to study. Okay, so we're going to wrap up there, and thank you everybody for coming along. Thank you again to Lydia for a really fascinating talk. Our next talk in our series is going to be on the 3rd of November, and that's going to be Mary Colwell, who's the author of a book about curlews, and she's going to be talking about what she's discussed in the book, and some more information about the work that she's been doing around studying curlews. So please do book for that.